I think we're really excited to have Mark Sutherland speak to us tonight. I first learned about vernal pools from him at a master naturalist class several years ago, and it stuck in my mind as something that it seems like very few people understand what they are or the value of them. And Mark has been working in this area for a long time, 30 years in general conservation. And he's now on the board of the Tapsco Greenway and the Howard County Conservancy. And I'm going to let you go ahead and start.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I see that my video went off and it's going to be, there's like,
You can turn your video on, Mark.
it just says I can't do it because the host turned it off, but that's okay. I can move
No,
along.
I'm my bad. Uh, you should be able to turn it on.
Okay, so let's just leave it off for the time being. I guess I could try one other thing. Let's see if this works. There we go. I just need to get my correct toolbar. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So that's the second time it said that. Don't let me do it, but and am I no longer sharing my screen?
No, you're not.
Yeah, so I mean,
Your screen is showing now.
okay, it is in full screen mode and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm here too. So great. Thanks. Sorry for the few seconds there, folks, but I really want to thank everyone for joining. Vernal pools is something close to my heart. And I think it's something that will be close to your heart if you learn a little bit more about it. Curious as to how many folks here knew what a vernal pool was or had even heard of them prior to this event that Kate has put together, which I really appreciate her doing that. And hopefully in just a few minutes, you'll be an enthusiastic supporter of protecting our vernal pools. So the first thing I want to say, of course, is that, I'm Mark Sutherland. Diana Devers, who I believe is going to be on the call. I can quickly check to see if she's here, but I'll pass it on to her for a few slides as we talk through it. And I also want to give some props to Jorge Borgantes Montero, who's with the Anacostia Watershed Society. He gave us some really cool slides of some critters that he's found in vernal pools in his area. But again, I'm representing Vernal Pool Partners, which is a relatively new group focused really on this at all levels of education, preservation, restoration, and legislation. And then Patapsco Heritage Greenway, where I'm also on the board, and Diana is the environmental program manager. So with that, we'll jump right in and talk about vernal pools by any other name. So you've heard the term before. Vernal pools is the most common name, and I think it's just a cool name. Of course, vernal is Latin for spring, which applies certainly in this part of the world. But there are many other ways to discuss what these ecosystems are, because they are temporary. Therefore, they can be also called temporary ponds. They're ephemeral, which is another word, of course, for that being temporary. We call spring ponds, again, using the English version. But seasonal pools is probably the most general way to think of them. In our part of the world, that is drying up in late summer. In other parts of the world, it can be different depending on the wet-dry cycle of the year. They're semi-permanent, they're woodland pools, geographically isolated. All those things are the same thing. They are vernal pools. You can see some here at the bottom occurring in different landscape types, and even in other parts, in other countries. So here's La Aguada, which is the term used in, this is the Yucatan of Mexico. I was on a trip there. This is a Calakmul archaeological site in the Yucatan of Mexico. And by chance, came across the sign. It was a very nice sign about, they're calling it seasonal water pools, another term for the same thing. So other parts of the world appreciate their value as well. But here's really what it is. The reason that they're different from other water bodies is that they are dry for part of the year and wet for part of the year. And this is the typical cycle. What you see here is in the fall, they begin as a depression in the land to fill up with water. And the water doesn't infiltrate, so it stays there, builds in depth over the winter as evapotranspiration and heat go down. And so they hit a maximum depth sometime in the winter. And in the spring, that's when, as things warm up, the activity starts, and the biological activities. And then as spring continues into summer, with heat and evapotranspiration increasing, the water is ultimately usually completely dry. The pond is completely dry by the end of summer. It can vary by year, but typically that's the case. And what does that mean? So it means one very important thing, which is that there are no permanent fish populations. So that is the driving factor. You have a water habitat that does not support fish and therefore can support other animals that can only breed without fish because their eggs and larvae are vulnerable. And so that's why these are unique and necessary for certain species. These animals are adapted to this situation of having a seasonal pool, a vernal pool that dries up. The animals either produce an egg or cyst that resists drying. So when it's dry, they're still alive, but they're no longer active. Or in most cases, they're amphibians. As we know, amphibians have a dual life, so they can live on the land and in the water. So they have the aquatic life stage when the pool has water. Then when it dries up, they go into their terrestrial stage. And there's various different kinds of plants. Typically, again, in this part of the world, it's a woodland environment, but there can be a number of different wetland plants that are characteristic. Swamp pink, Virginia sneezeweed are two examples. And then the biota are distinctive. This is why we really care about these. To a large extent, again, they produce a unique biota of all kinds of invertebrates. I'll show you some more pictures, but you've got different kinds of crustaceans, you've got different kinds of insects, you have other kinds of invertebrates that occur in vernal pools. But again, most importantly, you have these amphibians that are obligate breeders. They cannot breed anywhere but a vernal pool. That includes the mole salamanders, both the spotted salamander and the marbled salamander, and also the Jefferson salamander here. Wood frogs, which are the most common, and also eastern spadefoot toads, although I don't think there's any records for those in Howard County, but they're elsewhere in the state, certainly in the coastal plain and throughout the Piedmont. And a lot of facultative vertebrates. Again, that means animals that use vernal pools, but they don't need them. They can survive in other wetland areas. Spotted turtle is actually my favorite turtle. It's a beautiful guy. They use vernal pools a lot. So here's a cool graph that shows you, what goes on and why this interesting environment is seasonal. And you can see these different species that are all obligate species. These would not exist in the landscape if they didn't have a vernal pool. And you can see that they lay their eggs in the late winter, early spring. So let's go down to the second from the bottom is the wood frog. You see that right there. And from there, you can see that, in January or actually in my backyard on March 11th, they laid their eggs and then they begin to they grow and then they hatch ultimately a couple of months later, have a larval period that goes for a couple more months, and they produce a metamorph wood frog that then heads off into the terrestrial habitat. Similarly, you can see the spotted salamander at the top doing the same thing, starts a little bit later and goes a little bit later as well. So this is a fun graph to look at the seasonal aspect of vernal pools. Well, I've been talking about this depression, this place that has water in it during most of the year, but that's really not the entire ecosystem. There's really what we call 3 life zones. It's obviously a continuum and things vary, but you have this depression, which is where the water sits for the most part of the year. But you have, again, as I mentioned, for the amphibians in particular, a terrestrial part of their life cycle. So within 100 feet or so of this vernal pool envelope, that's where most of the water will come into the vernal pool. That's where marbled salamanders will lay their eggs in the fall. They will actually lay their eggs before the water arrives. So they lay in the fall, spotted salamanders lay in the spring. They know where it's depression and where there's been water before, and then it fills up. And they hatch earlier, and they beat out the spotted salamanders as first in size. And that's where you have, most of your animals living. But as a terrestrial adult, they'll move even further beyond that. So 100-foot radius, 1,000-foot radius is really where you capture about almost all of the individuals in a population. So it's really a larger watershed ecosystem that supports the vernal pool. So here's what they look like. Again, I've talked about them. Maybe you had a feel in your head, some kind of image. Maybe you've seen them before, but here they are. Again, mostly in the woodland context, but in some cases where they're fairly large, you'll have more solar radiation onto them, depending on the canopy around them. But this is what they might look like. And most people would walk past them and not even notice that there's anything in the woods that might be called a vernal pool. And here's what you find once time's good. So this, again, is from Jorge. He's done some vernal pool work in Anacostia Watershed Society. And here's the wood frog, which you're all familiar with. You've probably heard already this spring. And you see lots and lots of eggs. They produce these eggs in these masses. Each leg is sort of an individual jelly mass, and they're all connected together. The salamander eggs are covered with an additional jelly mass around it, so that's how you can tell the difference. But I'm not going into a lot of detail in the biology. I'm going to be more comprehensive on the whole issue today, but happy to answer questions. Again, from Jorge, we've got some other examples from the Anacostia Watershed Society. So they were out doing a lot of sampling. And again, that's something that people can do. It's one way to get involved. And so he has a farm pond pool on the left, which is a case, they're naturally in the landscape. They naturally fill up the way all lakes do over time, over thousands of years, but they can also be created by different land use changes. So this was a farm pond in the past. Now it's a vernal pool. The one on the right is a swale, again, where water runs, but it's now disconnected. Because if it's connected to a stream, then you have fish in it, so it doesn't act as a vernal pool anymore. It has predators. So in this case, it's a disconnected swale. And there's some of the critters. So this is one to show you these cool pictures here of different, this is some spring peepers on the left and some green frogs on the right. So those are not obligate, right? They live in other wetlands, but they do use vernal pools. And you can see some of the examples that he found in vernal pools in the Anacostia. Here's some microcrustaceans, ostracods, copepods, podocerans, really cool looking little guys that you need a little microscope or a hand lens to see any of these folks. Mollusks of various kinds, snails, clams, etc. They are. Annelid worms of various kinds are also found throughout vernal pools. So you have a really robust ecosystem, even though it just fills with water part of the year. It's amazing. Here's the farm pond in particular that you saw on the previous slide. You can see all these critters that they've found there. You can see all the different kinds of neat animals that are living there. Dragonfly larvae in particular are common. Some other ones, caddisflies, mites, rotifers, all kinds of really cool insects, as well as here's actually an invasive crayfish, the devil crayfish, which produces these towers that you might have seen before in a wetland area. And this is really interesting, just to give you an idea. Of course, I'm talking about vernal pools as if they're one thing, but of course they vary in size, they vary in the hydrography period, how long they're wet and how deep they get. Also, there's something called a magnolia bog, which is actually not a bog, it's really a seep. It only occurs in this area, metropolitan Washington area. It's because of sweet bay magnolia is the principal plants, and they're very rare. There's probably a dozen around. So they are a kind of vernal pool that has this unique vegetative habitat. Okay, so that's how wonderful it is and all those beautiful things about vernal pools and why they're so cool. And then you say, well, what's their situation today? And what do they face any threats? And of course they do, as the environment in general faces a lot of threats. Poor little guys dehydrated or desiccated here because of salt on the left. Various kinds of pollution can get into a vernal pool. Most commonly what happens is people don't even know they're there and they're just bulldozed over and they're gone with earth moving equipment. Other kinds of pollution can happen. And with climate change, the potential for them to dry up, like we had a very dry period this year. And I've certainly seen vernal pools that have dried up this period, and whether they come back, it will depend on how climate change proceeds in the future. Okay, so that's that. So hopefully you now know about vernal pools, and hopefully you're thinking they're pretty cool. But I wanted to sort of drive home, why should we care about them? So they're a neat thing, but what's going on here? So most of what I just talked about is the ecological services they provide for special species that we won't have wood frogs, we won't have mole salamanders, we don't have vernal pools. They are part of a larger aquatic and terrestrial food web. So again, the spotted turtles, the rusty blackbird is a bird that's in decline, but it occurs in vernal pools. There's one just out in western Howard County that was seen just last week at a vernal pool. And what's really cool about them compared to some other habitats is that they're throughout the entire landscape. So they are in my backyard, they can be in yours, can be in a park, but they can be in urban areas, they can be in different kinds of agriculture areas. So everybody can see them, and you can see them across the landscape and provide this biodiversity support. It's not like they have to be in a national park somewhere. You can just see it in your backyard. So what that means something to people, right? So in addition to just having those really cool critters around, They do remove pollution. Just anything that collects water and infiltrates it into the ground will remove pollution, replenish groundwater. Mosquitoes is a common concern because mosquitoes will grow in a vernal pool, but then they will get quickly eaten up once you have your biota going. I showed you all those insects and crustaceans that are out there, and amphibians are all eating mosquitoes. Those little dragonfly limbs can eat 1,000 mosquito larvae, in a day. So that's what happens. That's not the water that's creating a mosquito problem. It's the water that is occurring without predators in it, like tarps and flower pots and other kinds of things in your backyard. But mostly they connect people to nature. As I mentioned before, they can be in your backyard. And so they provide that connection that you can't get if you have to go out to a national park or something like that. So our quality of life is sort of reiterating what I just said, is they bring a richness to your life and appreciation of the natural world. Those of us that care, we might care about plants, we may care about flowers, care about birds. But this is a whole other piece of biodiversity out there. They're in your backyard, and of course they sing, right? You get the frogs calling, and that is really a cool sign of a healthy forest. As I mentioned before, they have, pollution and groundwater benefits for us. And ethically, from my point of view, it's part of nature and part of other living organisms that we should take care of. So now what can you do? Now, hopefully you do care and you've put this on your list of things to think about and see what you can do. And there's really, three different levels of things that you can do. First of all, of course, as we all know, you don't care about anything you don't understand. So this talk today and you taking it out to your friends and family, hopefully will begin to build more understanding about what vernal pools are. You'll go find some and see them. Those of you who are going to go on the walk next Monday will get a chance to see them and talk about them and experience them. And then you can go find your own because they're everywhere. And then once you've got that understanding and that care for it and that experience with them, you can think about very specific positive actions that you can take. So one of them is you can actually create them. The one in my backyard, which I'll show you a picture of, I curated a couple hours, really simple to do. You can contribute to the inventories and our understanding scientifically and locationally around the area. And Diana will talk about that. And then you can support preservation through legislation. And we've been working on that currently. I'll give you some updates on where that is going. But talking about building them. So it's not really an interactive situation here, but I'm sure many of you have heard of the Howard County Conservancy. And the map you're looking at is, there's a detail map and there's an aerial photograph of the Mount Pleasant property in Woodstock. And if you go there now and you pull in, along the driveway, and you come in and you go up to the very end of the driveway in the parking lot, and then you go down the hill, there's a vernal pool that was created. So we had this created with a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Trust to build a vernal pool right over there on the property. And this is what it looks like. So before it was built, it's my wife in the blue jacket. She's 5'4", so there's a little perspective. And then we, again, got a grant to dig the pool, make sure it had a impermeable clay layer at the bottom. And you can see my wife again looking at it here as it was just completed. And then here after it filled with water. And again, this filled on its own from rain. We selected a spot that had enough of a drainage to it, was flat, because again, anything on a slope is going to drain, and was impermeable because of the way it was constructed. And then some landscaping was done by Howard EcoWorks. You can see here the little landscaping plan and the plants that they put there around the vernal pool at County Conservancy. But here's the other one. So that was a nice, good size one, as you saw. Here's a really, really, really small one. My wife, myself, and here is the spotted salamander that came to our pool after 8 years. Wood frog showed up after 5 years, but the salamander showed up after 8 years. There's the eggs, and there she is, right there. We live less than a mile from the Columbia Mall, so we're not out in the woods. We're in a suburban area, but we have some old woods behind our house that were preserved as part of the development. And because we have that, we have these animals living underground, and they can use a vernal pool to breed if you create one. Okay, Diana, are you on?
Don't worry, I'm here.
There she is. Okay, Diana Devers, the environmental program manager for Patapsco Heritage Greenway, is going to talk a little bit about the program that they have.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name's Diana Devers. I'm the environmental program manager for Patapsco Heritage Greenway. And my background is in a lot of environmental science. And then I also did wetland studies for my master's thesis. So vernal pools are definitely near and dear to my heart because I think wetlands are a undervalued resource in the environment. So one thing that we do here at Patapsco Heritage Greenway, because we have a wide variety of things that we do, are not only vernal pool guided hikes, but also are doing a vernal pool inventory. So not only do we lead guided hikes, and they can be found on our website, which is just patapsco.org. I led 2 this past spring, and then we'll have another one on April 30th, which is actually in partnership with Howard County Conservancy, and we're going to look at their vernal pool, and we're going to see what theirs looks like. So we'll be doing a talk with them. And within those hikes, not only do we talk about what a vernal pool looks like, ways that you can find them easily, ways where it's like, hey, do we think a vernal pool would be over here based on our identifiers and things like that. But we also talk about how can we, as community scientists and environmentalists, really focus on how to make our entire environment better. And one of those ways is to do a vernal pool inventory. So we'll talk about how we have at PhD our own vernal pool survey, and it's just a index card size piece of paper where we go over some specific information, whether it's the date of observation, your location, from anything where you can put down your GPS coordinates to actually just describing it. I've had people say it's down this road to the corner, and I've gone out there and found it myself to do that. How long did it take you to get there? Just so that way we know like how many hours were you out there volunteering, some weather and temperature. It gives us a good idea of, is this truly a vernal pool? As is it going to be here? Are you out in February? Are you out in March? Are you more out in July? And it's out there. And then what does our precipitation look like? That it lets us know, like just Mark said earlier, we had a really large dry period throughout March. So actually, a good set of vernal pools that I usually like to go to are right along the trolley trail, starting at the trolley stop. And there's normally about 5 vernal pools all put together there. And because we had such a dry season, only 2 of them had water in them, which is really unusual. So not only did they have a low water amount, because of that, the vernal pool was much smaller than usual. So you could also tell that the wood frog eggs that were there and things like that were not in their usual places because there wasn't enough water in there. So having all of that information gives us a better look at what our Patapsco Valley looks like. And even if you don't live within the Patapsco Valley, we always say if you think it's a vernal pool, based on the knowledge that you know, I'd rather know about it. And then we can kind of look at it and see what it looks like than not know about it. And then other things we go into are kind of what are other parameters we might want to see. How deep is the vernal pool? What does our tree or canopy cover look like? What do you see inside the vernal pool? Do you see kind of a lot of eggs or do you see a lot of plants? And then what's going on around our vernal pool? Just like also Mark had said, a lot of the vernal pools that we tend to find tend to be either in one of 2 places, around a lot of developed areas or kind of in the middle of the woods. So trying to find a good road of that information always helps us. So collecting not only that required data and that optional data really helps us understand what's going on, but also helps us see different styles of vernal pools. Knowing from Mark, as I try to get more and more information about them, I'm finding a wide variety of size of vernal pool. I'm used to kind of a smaller one, and now I've found weirdly really large ones more in the Patuxent Valley than I have in the Patapsco. And then I find a lot deeper of pools in the Patapsco as I go farther up north into Carroll County. When I go home and I kind of go to my old stomping grounds near either that border of the Patapsco or in the Monocacy Valley. So having all of those things is really great for us because we highly value community scientists because you all are the ones that are seeing your backyard or the places that you consider your own backyard often. You can see the changes that are happening. You know when things are starting to sound like spring and if it's early or late, all of those things really help us. And as we've been learning more and more about vernal pools, our data set becomes more robust and we can constantly go back to our same vernal pools to see, are they changing? So we can actually have that information to go along with climate change as well.
Okay. So thank you, Diana. Anything else you want to add before we move along?
Nope, that's it for me. Thanks, Mark.
Again, thank you for coming and helping out. So yeah, you can contact us, check out patapsco.org, and we'd love to welcome you to to our citizen science activities. So then for those people who want to know more, there are a lot of good sources out there. There's a lot of work that's been done in the Northeast and some of the Appalachian areas. The one at the top that's highlighted is something that I worked on for EPA. So you can just search that online and find good general information, like the chart I showed you of the chronology of the different species. It's all in that document there. Other good documents out there. Tom Biebighauser is sort of the godfather of creating these things, has some great videos and guidelines on how to do that. So that's another good source. And Henry Wilbur was one of my dissertation professors, and he's got probably the first, really good scientific review paper on these kinds of organisms that live with these complex life cycles. So there's some things you can look up to as you get more interested in the topic. So let me talk about legislation. So again, what's the highest level of success we can have to protect these? Of course, is to have legislation and regulations that provide protections from them throughout Maryland or Howard County. And so we had a bill that we've now, this is our put in for a second year in a row. Delegate Terry Hill, who's Western Columbia, and maybe your delegate, and also Ruth and Terraza, who's Eastern Columbia, were co-sponsors of Vernal Pool Wetlands Protection Act of 2025. And so this is how it works. Last year, we put it in for the first time to provide protections, and we had to work with MDE because they are the regulatory agency. And there was a lot of discussion, and they weren't really comfortable that they understood what the definition should be that they would have to regulate. So we got the chairman of the committee and Maryland General Assembly to direct MDE to prepare a definition, which they did. You can see that here, to come up with a definition of vernal pool that could be used across state government to clarify the criteria for seasonal pools that should have protective status. And that was completed in December as required. And this is the definition. This seems all very technical, but as you can imagine, if you're going to regulate something, you need to be very specific. And so again, this sort of reiterates what we were talking about. Surface water for at least 2 consecutive months on a typical year, that's defined. Can draw down to nothing or 6 inches or less in a typical year. Provides persistent or breeding habitat for certain species. And that's the key part, so that not every puddle is regulated. It's the ones that are actually supporting these species. And we mentioned what they are. And then it's generally open. So it's not completely full of vegetation like most wetlands are, again, because of the way it's temporary. And they put a maximum size of 5 acres on it. All that was good, and we went in with legislation this year, as the session runs from January through April. And we'd hope that we would be able to get this passed. The bad news is we did not. The session is still in session, but it did not pass out of committee and cross over to the other chamber. So it won't be passing this year, but we still plan to revisit it next year with additional discussions with MD to make sure that we'll be able to do what we want to do, which is, as you see here, designate vernal pools as named wetlands so that they are protected like other wetlands. The reasons they're not protected now, and they're not protected federally, as you may know, the Sackett versus EPA decision said that any water body that is disconnected from other navigable waters is no longer protected on the federal level. That was a very unfortunate decision and a scientifically erroneous decision by the Supreme Court. But Maryland still protects wetlands, but they don't protect all vernal pools because most vernal pools do not have the 3 criteria of wetlands, which are the hydrology, the soils, and the vegetation, because of their nature, but they're just equally important. So we want to make sure that they're included. Here's some testimony going on last year. And again, Terry Hill, the sponsor, myself for Vernal Pool Partners, Eli for Audubon, Mandy from Patapsco Heritage Greenway. She's our water quality coordinator. So this is actually a little out of date, this particular slide, because I'm telling you to go call MDE. It's really not relevant now, but we'll do it next year. We'll revisit. But they were trying again to convince MDE to support the bill, which they didn't do for various reasons. I'm not going to get into the details, but again, they have concerns about how hard this would be for them to do, how much more staff they'd need to have, et cetera. I think we can overcome those barriers. But anybody who knows delegates or senators and wants to raise the vernal pool issue, they will be aware of this bill and tell them that you support it. We'd appreciate that. It's a long marathon as opposed to a sprint. So with that, I think, I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. This is a poem from Robert Frost, which I just thought was quite appropriate, and I'll just read it very quickly to you guys. These pools that, though in forest, still reflect the total sky almost without defect, and like the flowers beside them, chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone, and yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. The trees that have it in their pent-up buds to darken nature and be summer woods, let them think twice before they use their powers to blot out and drink up and sweep away these flowery waters and these watery flowers from snow that melted only yesterday. So that's a literary version of what a vernal pool is. And here is an audio version. Let's see if we can. So hopefully many of you have already heard these wood frogs calling this spring, and we'll continue to hear them along with all the other wonderful inhabitants of vernal pools. So with that, I'm going to close and take questions and hope we can have a good discussion.
There were a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if we want to unmute people and let them just ask them.
They should be able to unmute themselves or show their video.
Okay, Joe, do you want to ask your question?
Disinfect.
You muted yourself again.
Try it again, Joe, please.
I'll ask it. Years ago on a vernal pool walk, we had to disinfect our boots at the beginning and the end, and whether that's still necessary to do if you're going to go into a vernal pool, Mark.
Great question from Joe, and something that Diana or I would have mentioned once we got there. Yes, it's unfortunately there's disease transmission with people in the landscape is a continuing problem, and the chytrid fungus, which affects frogs throughout the world, specifically in Central and South America, also can occur here, and can occur even affecting salamanders in Europe. So anyway, yes, the idea is that you don't want to transmit any pathogens from one habitat to another. And one of the good things about vernal pools is that they are distinct, right? So they're sort of in their own little area, and they're not connected to other water bodies. So they're pretty much clean until you transmit something. And so, yeah, what you do, it's a simple bleach solution on your boots if you're going to go into the pond, to the pool. And so when we go next Monday and do the walk, I will have disinfected my boots, and I think we're not going to have anybody else go in just for that reason, because it's a little bit of legit. It's not hard to do, but again, we do ask people to do that because, again, you just don't want to introduce a pathogen that could be devastating to the local population.
On a similar note, what about lesser celandine being carried in the tread of boots?
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost ready to give up on lesser celandine. I mean, it's just one of these. We've changed our landscape, and we will continue to change our landscape with various invasive plants and animals coming in. And you obviously want to stop them when they show up if you can. In many cases, we've been able to do that for various things. In many cases, we've not been able to do that. So you're right. I mean, treading around, my yard has it now. I mean, it wasn't here except for the last 2 years. I've been here 20 years. It just showed up. Yeah, so it's just a good policy to clean your boots when you're hiking around. But lesser celandine is not going to be a problem for the amphibians. It's just a problem for outcompeting other organisms, at least during the spring season, I guess.
Okay. And Catherine asked if you can find skunk cabbage in vernal pools.
You can. Again, everything is different, a little bit unique. I was looking at some a couple of weeks ago, and there was some skunk cabbage typically occur in wetlands that are not going to hold water long enough to be really a vernal pool, so they can't support the life cycle of these amphibians, the few months that they're needed to complete their metamorphosis. What you'll really find with skunk cabbage often are red salamanders, which is another really cool species that requires sort of a mucky wetland area, but not usually as much standing water. But, you can in some cases find them. Other questions?
Well, I had a question about magnolia bogs. I'd never heard of these things before. And you gave a really brief description, but can you describe it a little
I
bit
don't know
more?
much about them either, but again, Jorge found one in the Anacostia watershed, and it's just, they're pretty much along the fall line. I mean, all these different ecosystem habitats that we have out there are categorized, with a certain name, and put into this box. But again, there's different variations of them. And with each of those variations, you have a different evolutionary history and you have different organisms. It's really, really cool. That's why nature is so wonderful. So the magnolia bogs are mostly sweet bay magnolia, but they're along the fall line. They usually have some gravel in the soils there. So I don't know if it was a case where, we had some kind of geologic motion that created some depressions that were then, populated with magnolia. So my understanding from just reading is that there's only, a couple dozen of them around the area, and they're just here. I'm sure there are other similar seep habitats that hold water with different vegetation types and so forth around that might have other names or not even be named, but these have been named because they are distinctively dominated by sweet bay magnolia. I don't know of any in Howard County.
I was wondering.
Yeah.
Does someone have their hand up? Deborah?
Yes, I have my hand up. Just a quick question about the upcoming walk. I think it sounded like we aren't all going to be going into the pools. So it's okay if we just wear regular hiking shoes and we don't necessarily have to wear waterproof boots, that can take wading into pools. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, we'll be right off a path. So it'll be simple to see the pool from the path. You can just walk up to the edge. I may not even go in myself if there's nothing to see in particular, but if there's something cool and you want to see something, I can certainly go in and point it out to folks. It's a fairly large one. Hopefully it's in good shape. And we'll walk past one that's completely dry. It used to be there, so you'll get a little picture of what it can look like, depending on what kind of year you've had as far as rain goes. But yeah, don't worry about having to go into the pool or being prepared to do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions from people?
When is this walk that you're talking about?
March 31st. It was a registered event. It was advertised in the newsletter for several weeks. If you're interested in going, we can probably fit you, Catherine. This next Monday morning at 10. It should be good.
I'll have to check, but thank you. So it's
Okay.
This Monday.
Yeah, March 31st, Monday, 10 a.m. Just send me an email. I had a question about you showed your backyard pond and called it a vernal pool. So what role do we have? Because one of the things I remember from your talk to us in the Master Naturalist class is you telling us how many vernal pools there used to be in Maryland, and how much of a part of this ecosystem they are. So if we were going to try to support this type of amphibian, I don't know, ecosystem, would you recommend backyard vernal ponds? How important are they?
So, I mean, if you're interested in doing that and you have some space, again, the key things you might have noticed if you look closely that my vernal pool has a plastic liner, right? So again, the soil in my backyard is not impermeable, so the water would run through. So you see, it's sort of just a unique serendipitous kind of situation to have one of these things. You've got to have a situation where you've got a depression on a flat landscape and the water doesn't infiltrate because there's a clay liner or some, obstruction to prevent it from doing that. So adding them, I think has value because you can imagine that if they were regularly throughout the landscape, that, whenever we grade something, which is what we always do when we develop, right? We basically flattened it out and we compact things and they're gone because you don't even know that they're there. If you're looking for wetlands, you typically don't know they're there. So, I mean, I'm not asking everybody to go out and do it. If you'd like to have one, I encourage people to have a yard that supports nature, and that can be plants of all kinds, support pollinators with native plants, places for pollinators to live in the ground, use your lawn for something else, or you can put in a rain garden or other kinds of conservation landscaping that infiltrates. So this is what I tell people. If you can put some native stuff in your land, you can, if your soil is permeable, then you have a rain garden, right? The water will flow through, go into the ground. It won't run off onto the hard surfaces and contribute to stormwater pollution. If it ponds up, then you got a vernal pool, so you can have either way depending on your landscape. But if you want to try to attract these organisms, and it was a flyer for me, I wasn't sure. Again, I live close to the Columbia Mall, so I'm not out in the woods, and but I have woods behind my house, and of course I actually have woods all around my house, and I look different than the other houses in my neighborhood because I've got all kinds of native plants growing through my yard, mostly trees. But they showed up, which was to me evidence that they're out there waiting for places to breed and expand themselves. So the fact that the spotted salamander showed up was really a wonderful day. Wood frogs are more likely to show up. But if you're interested in doing that, I would encourage you to do it.
I don't know anybody who's sorry to have put one in.
Okay, there you go. Yeah,
They all love the tadpoles.
Yeah, and once you start seeing things, it's like a mini ecosystem. You think about, okay, I've got to go to a park or somewhere to see something, or some river or whatever to see something. But here you have all these organisms that do different things over different times of the year. So it's really cool to have an ecosystem in your backyard.
Could you provide a reference for how to put your own vernal pool in to your house?
So that Tom Biebighauser, if you look him up with that funny name he's got, I can back up to that. He's got multiple things online, as well as some pretty significant books. Right there, Guide to Creating Vernal Pools, 2003. And there's all different ways to do it. The simple, it's really pretty simple. You can do what I did, which is to buy a plastic shell, put it in the ground, and it doesn't drain, but it doesn't have fish in it. So it acts just like a vernal pool. And I take the water out some years I don't. I just sort of let it. It's just basically full of leaves and fills up with water more in the wintertime and dries up some in the summer. But you can also create a larger one if you put in a liner. You get an impermeable liner. You just basically dig it out to some depth. A foot is enough, 2 feet. And you put a liner down, and then it'll hold the water. Or if you're lucky enough to have one where you dig it, and then when you pour water in, it doesn't infiltrate, then you're good to go right there. So just a small hand load, depending on the size, it can be done with hand labor. Even a big one can be done with enough people. But you can also use equipment if you want to make something bigger, like they did at the Howard County Conservancy.
And that book that you referenced, the Biebighauser one, it's not just for large vernal pools, but also for sort of home sized.
I don't remember that book. And what I would say is just search his name and say vernal pool, and you'll probably find a variety of things, including videos, different kinds. I mean, he typically talks about, larger ones that he's putting into parks. I actually worked with him. I mean, me and a bunch of other folks. He was in Wheaton Park in Montgomery County years ago, and we built one in an afternoon with a bunch of volunteers, and it's still there next to the nature center or whatever. So, yeah, so, I'm sure you can find that information there. And if
Bill?
I could do a little more research and get it to Kate, between now and next week.
Yep, I can send that out to people too. Joe asked, where do the animals come if you build a pool?
Yeah,
Where do
that's
they
the
come
amazing
from?
part. So again, the amphibians, of course, the invertebrates, can fly in or come in through other organisms. A lot of these crustaceans, arrive as eggs on bird feed and all kinds of crazy things like that. But the amphibians live underground. The mole salamanders, by their name, live underground. They live to 20 years old. And so they're living in the landscape, and they're looking for a place to breed. And they may have lost their vernal pool and just be not breeding because there's nothing around. And somebody put a vernal pool, and all of a sudden they got a place. And I assume that's what happened in my backyard. because I don't know of any other vernal pools nearby. But the fact that they were there means they were hanging in, because they can live for 20 years, and they just live underground. So we really don't know what they do during the winter. I mean, during most of the year, and but obviously they're living underground, probably at a low rate of metabolism, and they eat grubs and whatever there is out there, but they just need vernal pools to breed in during the year. And the wood frogs, of course, move around much more easily, hopping all over the place. I had green frogs, I had pickerel frogs in there as well, but they'll breed in other wetlands. The wood frogs only breed in the vernal pools, and they're on the landscape. And the other stuff will, the various insects, obviously can fly in. A lot of things can fly in.
You shared with me an article that I put in the latest newsletter, the Columbia Cares newsletter, about the Canadian town that shuts down their road for like 10 weeks every year so that the salamanders can cross and head into the vernal pools, which I thought was so cool.
Super cool. Yeah, so they migrate. I mean, as we just said, so they're spending most of the year underground. They're, in burrows and tree roots or whatever, and all of a sudden, hey, it's time to go breed, and they will, especially if you have big vernal pools, and you have decent populations, they'll all migrate to that pool, and they'll be coming, as I said before, from probably 1,000 feet away, and so they'll be crossing roads at different times and crossing over other parts of the landscape to get there. And so there are a number of communities, the Canadian one, but other ones in New England in particular, that shut down the roads, for a month or so. They basically, when they have the first warm rains, people are out there looking, and once they see them, shut down the road for however long it takes for them to stop crossing. So that's really neat. Or sometimes they won't shut the road down, and they'll just have people there catching them and moving them across the road, so that they have a safe passage. It's really, really cool when you go out there and see them when they're breeding. The way salamanders, both, frogs lay their eggs and then the sperm is added in the water, and salamanders, the males actually put down a spermatophore that the female takes up, and then she lays the eggs with that. So there's really no copulation going on with the salamanders, but it's all really cool, and they need water to do it.
Yeah, I think they do that activity at Jug Bay.
Yes.
I heard a seminar, citizen science seminar down there, and it's a big deal. They stay up all night long waiting for the creatures to cross the road. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, they have a pretty good population, and what a cool activity, right? Just to spend the evening with some salamanders. I mean, it's pretty neat because you don't see them, right? So they're gone. They're totally not there to see for 10 months of the year, and all of a sudden you've got them and you got a chance to see them. So it's one of those special things that comes out. It's a seasonal wonder of nature. Yeah, so definitely, if you have an opportunity to join one of those, I recommend it.
And has that spotted salamander returned to your vernal pond more than 1 year?
So I haven't seen. So the first year, I saw a couple of adults. The next year I saw a juvenile. So that was sort of like a sign that sounds like something worked, right? I never have seen the metamorphs leaving the pond, but I've had eggs for several years there. So they're coming back and laying their eggs. I'm just missing them. I have a game camera on it. I still have not captured them on my game camera yet. I hope to be the first person that I know of that's captured a salamander, breeding on a game camera. But so they continue to come back, and this year was wood frogs, which I hadn't seen last year. I got wood frogs this year, but I haven't seen the salamanders yet. But I'm hoping it's been every year for the last several years.
That's cool.
It
All right,
is
so
cool.
Gail has a question. Are there any special considerations in handling an amphibian if you need to move it?
Right. So the less handling is always the better with any organism, right? Unless it's your cat or your dog or whatever, I guess. So the idea, of course, is make sure your hands are clean. So you wash your hands off, and so you don't have any lotion or sunscreen or anything like that. And then you wash it. Then I would just wash it in the local water there, and then just put it in a bucket, right? So the idea is you could use a net or you can use your hands. I think as long as your hands are clean, you're fine. Then you put it in a bucket, so you're not holding it, you're not changing its temperature or anything like that. And if you're having to transport it, that's what you would do. But typically, I mean, that's what these guys are doing. I'm sure they're just putting them in buckets and walking them across the road if they're doing that. But most Most times you don't have to handle them, but they're pretty amenable. None of these guys are going to bite you. None of these guys are going to be dangerous. They have those yellow spots, which probably means that they are distasteful to various predators like garter snakes and stuff like that. But there's certainly no problem for anybody to handle them. Frogs are hard, frogs will jump, but salamander, it's almost like they're made for being your buddy because they don't walk very fast and they're not very skittish.
All right, Catherine has a question.
Oh,
Yeah, is there such a thing as a saltwater vernal pool?
Nope. So all these amphibians, are freshwater organisms because they have some people talk about them as being the canary in the coal mine for environmental degradation. And the reason they do that is because they have their skin open to the environment. And therefore, because it's permeable skin, they don't have any scales as opposed to reptiles. And therefore, any pollutants in the environment, any drastic changes in temperature and desiccation affects amphibians first. So they're pretty vulnerable and sensitive to those kinds of things. And salt would be one of the easiest things to kill off an amphibian would be to put it in salt because it would just suck the water out of the amphibian because they don't have an impermeable skin like a reptile does. So, yeah, so if someone puts a bunch of salt down next to a vernal pool for a pathway, that's bad news because it could damage the vernal pool or damage the organisms in it.
Yeah. I have a question about BT. A lot of people who are beginning to put in a pond or they have a natural vernal pool in their backyard put in the BT mosquito dunks. How do you feel about those?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of research. I recommend against it for two reasons. One of which is, the idea with Bacillus thuringiensis, it's an organism that prevents insects from metamorphosing, right? So they're larval and then they can't become an adult. And that way you can't have a mosquito come out as an adult to suck your blood. But that is not only mosquitoes. There's lots of other insects that you're stopping from living their life cycle by doing that. So you're affecting the insect community. And the second thing is, again, I don't think there's any conclusive evidence of any toxicity to other organisms, but there was one paper that I came across that seemed to show some adverse effect on amphibians from BT. But I could never confirm that, so I'm not going to say that's the case. So, just a caution against that. And the idea for the purpose of controlling mosquitoes, while they will be there when they first come out, so that I can't say that there are not going to be some mosquitoes coming out when the pond first fills up, because mosquitoes are pretty quick to get there. But once the other organisms show up, again, they're going to take down so I can just tell you from my own experience, there's a bunch of mosquitoes there the first few weeks, and then they're gone, because the organisms are eating the mosquitoes. They're not anymore mosquitoes and any ones that are landing in that pond are being eaten by the other organisms in the pond. But, I'd be interested to see if people use it and the amphibians work fine, then that's fine. You won't have the other organisms in there. And if that works better than the organisms, I'm not going to say, don't do it. I don't think it's going to create a bigger hazard. It just might reduce the insect population, and maybe that is the wrong thing to do. But nobody wants mosquitoes. They're not our friend.
Right. Any other questions? Well, thank you both, Mark and Diana, for coming and talking with us. I'm really excited about the walk.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing whoever signed up for the walk there next week. And thank you again. So interesting that our landscape is full of these things, and of these vernal pools, and we just don't know they're there. So thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting us and getting the word out. So happy to anybody who wants to know more, who wants to take action, again, about Patapsco.org. You should also now know vernalpoolpartners.org. It's a website that I'm using for my legislation, but I also have other information on there, and I have the connection to Patapsco Heritage as well. So if people want to check out that website, vernalpoolpartners.org, you'll learn some more stuff, and it'll be a way to contact me. You can always, I have an email, mark@vernalpoolpartners.org. So happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Take care. Thank you, Kate. Thank you,
Bye.
Richard.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.